Hi. Since 2002, Tom Finkelpearl has served as the executive director of Queens Museum of Art, which operates as a cultural crossroads in America's most diverse county through arts programs, community organizing, and educational outreach. He was previously deputy director at PS1 Contemporary Art Center during its merger with the Museum of Modern Art, and has also worked as the director of New York City's Percent for Art program, as well as the executive director of the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. Finkelpearl's book, Dialogues in Public Art, was published in 2000. His new book, What We Make, Conversations on Art and Social Cooperation, was released by Duke University Press in January 2013. Despite all of these activities, Tom Finkelpearl also really remembers the importance of eating, and I've heard a rumor that he always has a snack with him in his pockets. So that's just a note. If anyone gets hungry during the presentation, you know the guy to look for. So Tom, take it away.
Thank you. So, it's funny because somebody mentioned this rumor, and I said it's not true, but I was handing snacks out at that very moment. So it sort of disproved my disproof. So I just want to say thank you. I'm really happy to be here. It's sort of interesting because I feel like this is a community, right? We're all kind of community members. We all kind of know each other one way or another. And it's really nice to be part of a community, but I feel like I'm parts of different kinds of communities. And maybe I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So I just wanted to know, first of all, and this is not, whatever, I don't know why I'm asking, or why I'm equivocating. Who's read the introduction to my book? Okay, all right. So so you guys can start looking at your email for a couple minutes, and I'm going to just go through some of the ideas that are in the beginning of the book to frame what I'm going to talk about afterwards. And this has to do with institutions. So I'm going to try to talk about the institution that I run for the most part. So my feeling is that in the American context, there are a couple of reasons, sort of ways we got to this point we're at today. And a lot of this stuff happened in the 60s, and it's sort of there are like these 60s ideas, or ideas that were already in the air, but started circulating around in some depth in the 60s. This is Saul Alinsky. He's the father, or not the father of American community organizing, but the sort of the guy who articulated it. And he wrote two books. It was Reveille for Radicals and Rules for Radicals. And this is an example of the kind of rhetoric that was in these books. It's all about participation, the role, if you guys have, who's read Rules for Radicals or Reveille for Radicals? Okay, so everybody else in this room, you really have to read that book, one or the other, or at least an excerpt, because the description of a community organizer in that book is very similar to a lot of artists do. It has to do with interaction. It has to do with finding community voices. There's a lot of discussion about the question of equity, of how do you catalyze community intent? How do you find community leaders? How do you, hand your project on to the community? Anyway, so there's all this discussion within those books that sounds a lot like the kind of things we discuss now. In the early 60s, Tom Hayden wrote on the behalf of SDS, Student for Democratic Society, the Port Huron Statement. And again, I see someone in the front row who's old enough, like myself, to have read this thing. You guys should also read this. So a lot of the discussion, or a lot of the rhetoric, I was just thinking, so when you talked about my resume earlier, that made me feel old. And this is also making me feel old, sort of, looking at all this stuff from the 60s and talking about some of the stuff that I was really excited about when I was a kid. But I feel like it's relevant. So in the Port Huron Statement, it's about participatory democracy. These words keep coming, bringing people out of isolation into community, collective creativity. This is the same kind of stuff we're talking about now, but with a kind of more political bent to it. So if you took a group like the Diggers, who came out of the San Francisco mime group, the Diggers were in Haight-Ashbury in the Summer of Love. They did projects like, just walking into traffic and disrupting traffic as a kind of a social project. They had a soup kitchen as a collective project. And if you took them and you added in the kind of sensibility of political activism coming out of community organizing, or groups like SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a lot of folks were going down and organizing in the South, voter registration, et cetera, then you get something like, so Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin were members, highly influenced by the Diggers, and they said, we'd like to start the East Coast Diggers. And the Diggers said, well, you guys are too politicized, we're really just sort of anarchists over here. And so they started something called the Youth International Party, or the Yippies. And the kind of thing they did was go to Wall Street and drop the money from above, and all the people kind of went nuts, all the traders on this floor of Wall Street, and kind of revealed this big surprise, which is that Wall Street's really all about money. So that kind of political action, these guys thought of themselves as artists and thought of themselves as creating street theater. In fact, Abby Hoffman was quite upset that he wasn't getting a show at MoMA where some of the other sort of happenings artists were showing. So again, I feel like this is one of those sort of grandfathers of the kind of work that's being done now. Another important strain is that there was all this talk about the group in feminism, group therapy, these group encounter sessions. This is New York Radical Women. A lot of them had also participated in civil rights movement and had felt quite alienated because the civil rights movement was so run by men. Women were, doing the dishes and cooking. So there was this feeling amongst the women that the rhetoric of inclusion, the rhetoric of participatory democracy didn't include them. So there was this, within New York Radical Women, a lot of the people were thinking about SNCC, and at a particular meeting, a woman named Carol Hanisch said, they were talking about the Miss America pageant. Miss America pageant, for people my age, everybody in America seemed to watch that. You can be in the most liberal household and you're watching the Miss America pageant. So we're talking about it from a feminist perspective, and Carol Hanisch said, let's do a snap action like SNCC. And let's go to the Miss America pageant on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. And they did, and they did an action which looks a lot like a participatory art project. They called it street theater. It got tons of press, and it was an incredibly important moment for the expression of second wave feminism. So all of this stuff, none of the stuff that I have shown so far is really sort of part of art history in the way that Muriel Euclid is. So Muriel Euclid is a feminist. She is a mother. She started to think about how to generalize her experience as a woman, as an artist, put those two things together, and she became a maintenance artist. So this is Muriel Euclid's, cleaning the steps in front of a museum. She then generalized that to become the artist in residence at the Sanitation Department of New York City. I hope people are all aware of this stuff, right? You're certainly aware of the Muriel Euclid side of it. But I'm trying to tie it in with feminism, with the kind of rhetoric of participatory democracy. Another thing that I try to trace in the introduction to the book is this idea that a lot of interesting thought around the idea of participation was happening in Fluxus. There were important Fluxus artists who left, like Alan Capro, who was doing performances, but he became he was a happenings artist. He was an extremely important teacher. A lot of people who couldn't make money elsewhere, like a lot of people in this room probably aren't going to be able to, went and taught, right? So if you're not making objects, you have to make a living. And Alan Capro was amongst those people. He became an incredibly important teacher in California. Suzanne Lacy was one of his students. Suzanne Lacy was, again, the teacher of another person who's in the book named Lee Ming-wei. So if you took something like this as Yoko Ono in a piece called Cut Piece, where people from the audience would come up and cut her clothes off, it was quite an important, famous piece by Yoko. That's a straight up Fluxus work where there's an audience and there's an interactive nature of the performance with the audience. A little bit later, by the time Alan Capro was doing this project, there was no audience. The happening was something that people did together. There wasn't this relationship between the audience and the actor. So Capro, if you take Capro and you add feminism, you get Suzanne Lacy. I mean, this is like a super simplification, obviously. But there was, this is, if you ask Suzanne Lacy and some of these people, they'll actually agree with this to some degree. So this is a happening in a way which is a feminist happening. It's like a group session. At each table, there are a group of older women talking about sexuality and, in their lives. And the audience is in the back, and then after a certain point, the audience is allowed to come down and stand around those tables and listen. So it's a direct quote from the kind of encounter sessions that New York Radical Women and others were doing. So if you go from Capra to Suzanne Lacey to Lee Mingwei, these are, teacher, student. This is a project Lee Mingwei did at Harvard, where he did an ad in the Crimson and other local papers, and he asked, are there seers in the community? Seers are people who could see the future. And this is Harvard, so this is done at Memorial Hall. And so it's a very, sort of straight-laced place. But there turned out to be people who could see the future in the physics department and other parts of the school. And so you would go into that enclosure. This is people waiting to go inside that enclosure, and you would have your future read, tarot cards, palm reading, et cetera, in a completely undocumented encounter. So again, I feel like this is a kind of a straight line between the participatory democracy, the participatory practices of the 60s down through the present. And another line is obviously the most influential of all the artists I talked to do my book. The person who came up most often was Joseph Beuys. This is his first lecture in America. One of the things I was trying to figure out in the book was not just, was Beuys important, but when did his ideas come to America? There's a big difference between when somebody said something and when it became important to artists. And that was one of the things I was trying to figure out. So this is when his ideas started to take shape in America, when he came over here for his first lecture. So then you take an artist like, and this is what he was saying at that lecture. This is quotes from that very lecture. He's talking about social sculpture, creativity. He's talking also not necessarily just about artists. So I think his work got kind of creatively misinterpreted by a lot of American artists. But there was a young African-American artist named Rick Lowe down in Houston, and he was involved in a place called Self-Help for African People Through Education, SHAPE Community Center. And he synthesized what he was doing as an activist in the African-American community there with Joseph Beuys, and as you know, came up with actually a coalition of folks, not just Rick, came up with this idea to do Project Row Houses. And that's Rick renovating one of the houses. This is Project Row Houses. So I just wanted to go through that stuff to say that this is the kind of stuff that's at the back of our minds. So how do you then, or how could you, create an institution that's based on those ideas of participatory democracy, of inclusion, with consciousness of, gender roles, et cetera, that were going on, that were the sort of the basis of the ideological platform of the Queen's. So that's where we're trying to start from. I just wanted to then show you what our, that's my wife, Eugenie. I'm sorry, I didn't, oh shit, sorry. Hold on one sec. Okay, now while I'm doing this, I'm gonna just play a song for a second. So who wrote No Woman, No Cry? Anybody know? Right. So yeah, Bob Marley wrote it. Who got the credit for it? This guy named V. Ford, because V. Ford was running a soup kitchen in Trenchtown in Jamaica. And what's it about? Why should she not cry? Because you should remember, when we used to sit in the government yard in Trenchtown, observing the hypocrites mingle with the good people you know. So it's a song about public space, and it's an act of charity, right? The money's going to this guy who's doing right? And this is a recording of No Woman, No Cry, collectively created with the audience, right? So it's live. Everybody's singing. As soon as the song comes on, everybody's singing No Woman, No Cry together with Bob Marley. So I got my website up here. So I just wanted to put that in because there's social practice that's not made by artists that is unbelievably powerful, that satisfies. Could you imagine if somebody got up here and said, I got this video, and it's of this live thing I did, and it's got 75 million views. By the way, I sat down and watched all the Bob Marley singing No Woman, No Cry. You should do this tonight. What an unbelievable performer. All the live sessions, I think there are 5 or 6 on YouTube. Many of them have tens of millions of views. And to think of the money that went to this soup kitchen. So I wanted to put that in there, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in another example. Social practice art doesn't have to be discontinuous from other kinds of social practice. And I would put that Bob Marley, in a way, at the pinnacle of social practice. Oh my God, what happened to my website here? Where is it? It's E. All right. Thank you. All right. So I just wanted to show you, this is our website today, live, and I'm going to sort of explain what it means. We have a show called Arte Utile, which is up. This is Arte Utile Lab. Today, we have Korean Club for Families Affected by Autism. We have basic printmaking in Mandarin. Next week, we're going to have our LGBT film series. So the idea at the Queen's Museum is to try to be inclusive, to try to understand, the different kinds of audiences that we can work with. All right. So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint now. So I inherited the directorship of a museum. It's in the most culturally diverse place in America, but it has this incredible history also. And the history is that it was built for the 1939 World's Fair, that the UN General Assembly met in our building. This is the building as it looked in 1939. This is the UN meeting in our building. So the partition of Palestine happened in our building, November 29th, 1947. Korea, a lot of negotiations around the partition of Korea. UNICEF was born in the building, et cetera. It's a very historic place. We also have this unbelievable object, which is the largest architectural model in the world. Do you see the people standing in the back of this thing? Right. So these are people back here. This is a very large object. And we have invited a bunch of artists to do projects on this object. So this is just like this mechanism, attractive mechanism. Tens of thousands of people come to visit it every year. This is a project done by Greg Gillette where he asked, if you could add an island to New York City, what would it be? And all these different artists made their suggestions. Greg then made the buildings. The idea of this particular island was to build an island big enough for 8 million people to live in, so empty out New York City completely and have one big building in Jamaica Bay. We invited an artist you guys may have heard of named Mike Rakowitz to do a project. Mike was interested. It's interesting because he's a very political guy, as you might have noticed from some of his projects. But you don't always have to be political, and the Queen's Museum isn't always political. This was a project about cinema and perception. So what Mike did was put cameras on the panorama, and he found the exact angle of film stills from famous movies. This is him looking at the camera angle of a particular, what movie was that from? Naked City. And then actually this is the pairing. So the Naked City pictures over here, the picture that he identifies. So it's a live feed from the panorama. And then as you walked around the panorama, you could look at these captions and these exact film angles. Another project we did was with Damon Rich, which was to mark every block in New York City which had 3 or more foreclosures the previous year. So this was actually before the financial crisis. Remember the housing crisis, which brought down the world economy? It was kind of a premonition of what was about to happen. But it got a ton of press, it got a lot of interest. And Damon was also able to go out into communities in Queens and talk to people about housing. It was a really amazing project, using the panorama as a mechanism. But I think that all of that stuff wouldn't be, I wouldn't be speaking about this institution if we did sort of a lot of art projects around the panorama. So let me just tell you a little bit about Queens. Queens, as I said, is the most culturally diverse place in America. If you look what happened to American cities between 1950 and 2005, there was this exodus of people. Look at what happened to St. Louis, for example. It lost 58% of its population. And guess what happened in Queens that refilled it? It was immigration. So Queens has 47% foreign-born, and that's what repopulated American cities. The American cities that are doing well now are American cities that have large immigrant populations for the most part. So this is, the Queens Museum is sort of in this area here. These are census tracts with 50,000 or more foreign-born. That's our audience, which is from those same census tracts. And then within these communities, there's an incredible amount of diversity. So, within Latino or Hispanic, there's 613,000 people, and they're equally divided between a lot of different kinds of different countries of origin. Same thing goes with Asian. Portland has 583,000 people. There are more Spanish-speaking people in Queens than there are people in Portland. So we decided at a certain point, what we have to do is become a community facility. There was interesting discussions this week about this idea of community art and what's the difference between community art and what we're doing. And I think one of the differences is that people want to draw a line, a sort of distinction between themselves and community art based on all kinds of issues related to power and class. But one of the things that we're trying to do is to figure out how could you be a community center and be a fine arts collecting institution at the same time? What can you learn from community centers that is of use to a museum? And I think that, that what you guys did with Shine a Light the other day, which was fantastic, and thank you for, that was really, I took all kinds of video, and I'm going back to the museum, we've got to do something like that in Queens. But one of the things you did was just open the doors and let people in and sort of lower the bar in terms of, how perfect everything had to be in a way. So one of the things we've done at the Queens Museum is just open the doors. This is a community meeting at the Queens Museum. It actually has nothing specifically to do with our programming, but our city council member, Julissa Ferreras, is here. She's speaking to a group, and we're talking about sort of envisioning the future of Flushing Meadows Corona Park. We had several tables that were taking place in Spanish. So another thing we did was sort of look around Queens and sort of try to understand what it is, the essence of Queens. This is a project by an artist named Jeff Liao, and it was about the 7 train. So these are projects sort of about Queens. This is a woman who did a project where she said that, in Mexico, the #1 industry is agriculture. #2 is remittances from America. So there are people in this who are working these incredibly long hours and sending money back to Mexico. And this guy, Mr. Lara, is sending $350 back every week to Mexico. I mean, I can't do that on my salary. I can't imagine how this guy is doing it. So she said, these are the superheroes of 2 economies. And she dressed up, got people to dress up in these superhero outfits, took pictures of them doing their regular job, and this is a show we had. I've met actually a lot of these folks who actually live nearby the Queens Museum. We did a show about Mexico City called ABCDF. We did a show with Yu Minjin, a famous mainland Chinese artist. This is a project we did, which was there's this big biker community, lots of different biking communities in New York City. This was a BMX biking spectacular, which took place in the galleries at the Queens Museum. So these are ways of sort of integrating or discussing our agenda with our community. We have something called Passport Fridays. I don't know if you guys, this is Jose Serrano. He was here last year, maybe. This is every Friday night in the summer. You have Mexican night and Taiwanese night, and et cetera. And it's a kind of multicultural festival of dance, music, and film. We went out into the park, and we invited a guy named Duke Riley. Do you guys know Duke Riley's work? So he wanted to do a naumachia, which is a boat battle. So the battle was between the Queens Museum, the Bronx Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, and it was each museum had a boat, and we had staff. It was actually quite. My wife works at the Brooklyn Museum. There was like this Twitter face-off between the Brooklyn Museum and the Queens Museum, like, we're going to kick your butt. And we had to call maintenance guys back from vacation. And actually the Brooklyn Museum showed up. There were all these sort of little, social media experts. And we had our whole maintenance staff ready to go. And we called in, I don't know if you guys know Sean Leonardo, who's like a muscle man artist. So the battle took place. It was unbelievable. We had everybody showed up in togas. They came to the museum. 1,500 people put on togas, got drunk, and went out into the park. And so it was a way. And then actually, what happened? The whole park kind of emptied out into that. And so we had all the soccer players, and I called the police in the middle of it. I actually didn't want them to shut it down. We had a permit to do it, but I wanted them to see what was going on. And actually, when I talked to my lawyers the next day, they said the best thing that I did that night was call the police during the event. And the police said, this is no problem. We have much worse things happening in Corona than this all the time. And the reason I was glad that I had called them in, and the reason that the police, having that stamp of approval from the police, was that Duke did this completely illicit and unplanned fireworks display with no permits in the middle of a crowd of 1,500 people. And so I had to, whatever. Got in a lot of trouble with that. Nobody got hurt. But these are the kind of projects that we do from time to time. By the way, the day after that, El Museo del Barrio had a boat in this. And there was a staff meeting at El Museo at the same time as we were having a staff meeting of senior staff. And they told Julian Zugazagoitia, who was the director at the time, this is incredible project. We have to start taking more risks. And I had called in my senior staff and saying, we have to start taking less risks. So we haven't done anything quite that physically dangerous since then. But so another thing that we do actively at the Queens Museum is we have 3 art therapists on our staff with degrees in art therapy. This is something, it's not that productive to invite people in the door, let's say people with disabilities, if you don't know what a valuable educational experience is going to be for somebody on the autism spectrum as opposed to somebody, whatever, a Down syndrome kid or an adult mental patient. So this is something we've built out. We have a big autism initiative. I think I showed on the website at the beginning there that we're having our Museum Explorers Club, which is for families with kids in the autism spectrum. The other thing is that in Queens, if you can imagine the sort of alienation from society that occurs through autism, multiply that times, let's say, not speaking the language, maybe not necessarily being in the country legally. It's a fraught situation, and this is a lot of those programs take place before the museum opens. And I think it's one of the most meaningful projects that we do. In Queens, 43% of people speak English at home. That, being the case, we thought, let's start doing multilingual programming. So we now, I think I showed you on the website, there's our basic printmaking in Mandarin. We're teaching in Mandarin, in Spanish, in Korean. We've taught in Tibetan, in Urdu, Bengali, a lot of different languages that there were a lot of people in Queens could use that language support. So I feel like, the people that have the doors open more than museums, are libraries. And you have the difference between a library user and a museum visitor. People go to libraries because they think it's a meaningful thing to do in their life. The Queen's Library System has 66 branches and 22 million visitors a year. So if you compare that to the Metropolitan Museum, which has 5 million, it's 4 times as many people as going to the Met. The average man, woman, and child in Queens goes to the library 10 times a year. That's the average. So there are people that go 100 times. So we started a partnership with the Queen's Library System. We have a long-term partnership. And these classes, this is a graduation ceremony for a class in Mandarin and a class in Spanish. These classes take place first at the library. So you're in your community. You're doing something you've asked for, like a Photoshop class or a Dreamweaver class or whatever, in your language for 4 sessions to gain the trust to then move it over to the museum. So then the second, so Photoshop 1 will be in Mandarin or Korean or Spanish or whatever. Photoshop 2 is in English, and there's a big ESOL component. We've done all these programs that relate to introducing communities to one another. So that's that. There's a website. I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. Okay, this is one of the things I want to talk about also is this is an artist named Miguel Luciano. Miguel did a project called Pimp My Piragua. And it's a Piragua cart, like the coolest Piragua cart. It's got video and everything. When it was in the museum, it was a work of art. As soon as it rolled out the door, it was a Piragua cart. And it was sort of dealing with these traditions. So when he was out there one day, he met a group, it was a Mexican bike club, and they had this incredible creativity within the community, which is very similar to what Miguel was doing, but it wasn't called art. So I feel like once he rolled it, the same object can be art when it's inside the doors and not art when it's outside the doors. I'm going to skip past this one. All right, so I guess the thing that I wanted to focus a little bit more on is that we have followed artists outside the doors of the museum. And the artists are the ones who really taught us how to do what we want to do. This is an artist named Maria Ponce, and she did a project on Ecuadorian National Day, which was an interactive project that she'd been working on for several months, where she met the guys in the Mundaza structure, these informal moving companies, and she talked to them about their family back in Ecuador. And they sent video postcards back and forth. And inside the trucks were these video postcards. On the outside of the truck was a video that talked about Ecuadorian landscape. And it was very sentimental for a lot of people who hadn't, a lot of Ecuadorians in Queens are undocumented, which means that they're unable to go back and forth a lot. So this project brought us to a place called Corona Plaza. And what we realized was that this is just an incredible place to do public programming. There's a subway stop in the middle of it. Thousands of people are getting out all the time. And we started to do projects. This is a dance by a local dance company in that plaza. So this is just right now where Maria was working. And this is a project by Sean Leonardo. He's one of the guys who was on our boat in Duke Riley's project. You can see why we invited him. He did a project which used the sort of symbolism and tropes of lucha libre wrestling to do a project where he wrestled against the Invisible Man. And it was really amazing also to see that all the kids got it 100%, because kids wrestle the Invisible Man on a regular basis, right? But the adults were like, it's a bunch of bullshit, there's only one guy in there, and But he did actually end up losing the match. But what's important about it also is that, and by the way, it's really, it was funny, but it was also, he was really, really good at this. He had practiced a lot. He's diving through the air. There was a level of skill and artistry that's hard to see from the slides. And this guy's a bodybuilder. He looks the part. In any case, if you see in the background, this is the audience, and the audience was from Corona and from around. In the background, you see the tents. And at the tents, we're working with a hospital, Elmhurst Hospital. If anybody gets to New Yorker, there's an incredible article about Elmhurst Hospital. So these are the tents I'm talking about. Elmhurst Hospital is a hospital that has every disease in the world. Last year they had to translate in 153 different languages because they had 153 different languages represented by their patients. So they have these crazy exotic diseases that they know all about because they got people from all over the world. There was a certain kind of temporary paralysis that's very common among certain parts of the Philippines that was discussed in the article. In any case, Elmhurst Hospital had told us that there was a high incidence of high blood pressure and diabetes amongst Latin American women in Corona. So in those tents in the back, people are getting tested for high blood pressure and diabetes, and they're getting referred to Elmhurst Hospital for treatment. And there's a lot of people out there with those ailments that don't know they have it. So even though Sean's project wasn't particularly political, or even it had a kind of publicity campaign aspect of it, the arts in this case, in a lot of cases, were just a way to draw a crowd. You had the crowd there, and when you're there, when the crowd's there, if you have the community connections, you have the ability to then spread the word about some social good. Ghana Think Tank did a project in Corona. We have Ghana Think Tank here today. And they were, if you guys don't know Ghana Think Tank, it's a kind of interrogation process. And the basic idea of the original project was that there'd be a think tank in Ghana. Normally you have a think tank about Ghana in Bethesda, Maryland. In this case, you have some problems in New York City, and you ask a group of folks in Ghana for the result, for the solution. So what happened here was, I felt the most valuable part of the project, and you can talk to our Ghana Think Tank's brothers and sisters in the audience today, was that we got a group of people able to ask a bunch of questions, and I was at some of the sessions. The question asking was incredibly educational. I'd already been working in this community for, 7 or 8 years when this happened, but I'd never spoken frankly behind closed doors to a bunch of long-term Dominican residents about what they felt about the Mexican and Ecuadorian influx. It was really, really interesting, sort of upsetting, but something that had to happen. In any case, that was a wonderful project, which brings me to the next stage. So in the process of working in Corona Plaza, and Ghana Think Tank, by the way, is working in Corona, we got involved in local politics, with a local city council member. And we came up with this idea to make Corona Plaza together with not just us into one of these pedestrian plaza where we would close down the street. And this was adopted by the Department of Transportation of New York City. They closed the street permanently, and it's now a pedestrian plaza. It's an incredibly well-used plaza, and there's $2.8 million in the budget right now to completely renovate Corona Plaza. We brought in some tactical urbanists to work with folks in the community to try to figure out what would be a good thing to do with this new public space. But again, one of the things that you see, again, we have the same situation where we have kind of arts programming going on. Here, we have the sort of social services going on in the back. This was a traditional dance group from the community. And there's also sort of a mixture of the social art projects. This is a project called Uni, which is a mobile library. So, and again, the basis of this is long-term investment. And I think one of the things we've been talking about is, what happens when the artist leaves? But in this, and if you as the artist are the one who's instigating the social investigation, then it's a lot to put on your shoulders. And I was listening earlier about the, in Braddock, being at the library, trying to, as a small, scrappy, emergent nonprofit, how do you make something sustainable? The way that we're able to do it, so we have 40 people or 38 people on our staff, we have the budget. So we have 2 community organizers who have been working in this community for 7 or 8 years. What happened was we had programs already going on in Corona. We had we're working on an outreach model. We were interviewing for a job, and a community organizer came in. This was not my brilliant idea or Prerna's brilliant idea. So this community organizer came in and wanted to apply for this job. And it was like, well, and I've never done this. Can you imagine this in a job interview? So I said, could you go into the other room for 15 minutes, come up with like a sketch of a plan, and we're going to come back and you're going to tell us what you're going to do in Corona? Because who hires a community organizer to do art programming, sort of outreach? So she went into the other room, she came back and said, my community organizing mentor said you get to the parents through the kids, and she had this whole structure, and she had actually Googled on her BlackBerry, whatever the community organizations were in Corona, although she had some background there already. So we hired her, and this was one of these aha moments, which is, the same thing I said about art therapists, which is it's one thing to invite people with special needs into the museum. It's another thing to invite them in with some kind of expertise on your side. So if you guys are interested in community interaction, you can either work with community organizers or you can actually go to community organizing school. And we've done this with staff members. You can go and there's different places. You can get the training, get a week or 2 weeks. It's not that expensive. So I urge everybody, if you're interested in interaction, look at how people who are actually professionals in interaction do it. Why do you think that Obama's campaign, whatever you think about him, he definitely runs a good campaign. Because he's trained in running campaigns. That's what he did. That's what you learn to do as a community organizer. So I wanted to say that all of this stuff that I'm talking about is on the shoulders of that community organizing energy. So this is an advertisement for a soccer tournament. Near the Queen's Museum is this big, bleak area of chop shops where they're doing kind of this car repair. But in those chop shops, there were these little informal soccer games going on, and it was usually just the Peruvians playing with the Peruvians and the Mexicans playing with the Mexicans. So they decided to do this big tournament, they meaning an art group called Artifacting, and they created a kind of weird Mad Max-like stadium, and they did a multi-tiered tournament over 2 weekends, and it got a ton of press. Actually got a really great article in the New York Times. This is one of these quick interventions that didn't result in a soccer league. There was some hope that it might, but it brought forward the issues that were on the table about that particular place. And I think that's another thing that art can do. It doesn't always have to last forever. It can bring forward the issues. Okay. We were talking about, I went to the sports, or the game session in this room, which was quite cool. And then is bad at sports, are you guys here? Bad at sports, yes. So I was thinking, there's a lot of people in the art world who are bad at sports, but there also is a kind of beauty in sports. And I just wanted to show this photograph. And these guys were really good. And part of the beauty of it was that they weren't bad at sports. By the way, I endorse bad at sports. You should meet them. But we were talking about, there was this really cool project about, the marathon that takes 3 months, or the round of golf that took 4 months. And I love that stuff also. But I do want to put in the good at sports plug also. Okay, and then I'm going to talk about immigrant movement for a while. So all of this stuff was kind of in-depth community programming, which was just completely brought up to the next level by Tanya Bergara. Now, you guys heard Tanya talk about this last year? So raise your hand if you've already heard Tanya Bergara talk about this. All right. All right, so that's a dilemma. All right. Because that's like, so raise your hand if you really don't know anything at all about Tanya Bergara's immigrant movement. Don't be shy. Would you like to?
I'd be happy to hear how you talk about that project.
First she said we would be happy. She was speaking on behalf of everybody.
I agree. I'm there too.
Okay.
I'll second.
All right. Great. Thank you. That solves it. All right. Man, that's a relief. All right. So Tanya, I had met Tanya. I went to Cuba, and I met her at the very tail end of her fantastic school, and that's actually in the book. And it was a 7-year project, and it was just wrapping up, and I think it was the best art school in the world while it existed. And one of the reasons, so I went there, and that week, Artur Ziemiewski, who of, Berlin Biennial infamy, did an art project with the students. And there's this, how many people have been to Cuba? All right. So, any Cubans? All right. So there's not much to do in Cuba, right? Especially if you're a Cuban. I mean, it's like, there's people they don't have cars, they don't have, the internet. I mean, God, that might be good, right? Not having the internet. But your average person in Cuba doesn't have it. There's all kinds of, interesting things in Cuba, like everybody has straight teeth and glasses, and they are healthy, and they're not living in cardboard huts. But at the same time, there's 3 kinds of police on every street. There's like the CIA guys stacking in their, shoulders, and there's like informants, and then there's the, the military and the police. So it's just a repressive state. I don't want to glorify it. But I met Tanya at the I was doing research in my book. So she came to New York City. She said, "We want to do a project about immigration." I said, you definitely have to do that in Queens. She really didn't know much about New York or especially about Queens. So Creative Time and the Queens Museum invited her to do this project. It's called Immigrant Movement. And the idea was to create a space which was simultaneously like a community center for immigrants in the community and a think tank about immigration. There's a lot of Dream Act dreamers in Queens. This was an amazing session where about 75 dreamers came together to talk about their agenda. This is again our city council member. This is Tanya. This is Julissa Ferreras, first Latina in the city council. Been Latinos, but not Latinas. This is the great Rick Lowe. So this was a kind of think tank about useful art, which brought together community members. Actually, there's two people here. Now, Dylan is in this picture, right? There's Dylan, yay! Hey, Gavin. Is Gavin in the picture? Anyway, there's a couple of people here in this room or in that room. So the idea was to talk about useful art. This is in preparation for the Arte Utile lab. So there's that kind of project. This was a slogan writing workshop. This woman down here is Alex Garcia, is one of these. You know, when you talk about these projects, I mean, I get to talk about it all the time. The people actually do the work on the ground that's Alex Garcia is one of our community organizers. I guess Prano was here last year. These are the people that actually do the work. So I want to make that clear. You know, yesterday I was at the stand and we got this delicious empanadas. And you were there also. So it was the kid was serving, and the kid spoke very good English, and the parents didn't. And this is this image of what's called the parentified child. And this you see in Queens all the time, which is, you know, you saw who speaks English at home. Like 40% of Queens speak English at home. A lot of the parents really don't speak good English. So you have this situation very commonly where the kids speak much better English than the parents. So you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, and your 8-year-old is doing the interacting. So it's an interesting, I mean, I have to say that as horrible as that is, when I've met the kids who have been in that situation, they've taken on responsibility at a very early age, and they're very mature and well-spoken and can speak to adults in a very sort of fabulous way, despite the fact that I'm not, you know, I mean, I know the difficulties as well. But so here's a young woman writing up one of the slogans. And this woman here is also a key player. This is Maria Canella. She's one of the incredible sort of leaders in the community. The idea of immigrant movement is also to hand it over to the community at some point. This is a community organizing idea, that you find community leaders, that you create a series of campaigns that could be self-sustained by the community. So within the next year, we're hoping that the leadership of immigrant movement is going to be from the community. And Maria Canella is one of those kind of leaders. So one of the slogans that came out of that was Immigrants Imagine a Better Future. That was, we went to Occupy Wall Street and did on Immigrants Day, December 18th, did an action down there with Creative Time. This is the El Sistema Youth Orchestra. I don't know if you guys know, this is a Venezuelan group, or a Venezuelan way of teaching classical music. And the kids have to earn their violins. Once they earn their violins, you know, there's this whole thing. You have the paper violin. You start with rhythm. It's an incredible system which has produced amazing classical musicians. So one of the things that I always like to say is that, you know, you don't think of classical music in relationship to social practice, but depending on the structure of the interactive, you know, process, classical music does have this incredibly sort of liberatory effect for these kids in that situation in Corona. All right, so with all this in mind, we're getting to, I'm supposed to be talking about institutions. So we're an institution. We have managed to raise $70 million to build a new building. Most of that money is coming from public sector. We're very tied in with the local political structure. We are under the umbrella of New York City. We're getting a ton of money from the city. And, you know, this is all, you know, part of, you know, the way we do our social practice is you have to raise money. And we're actually not talking much about money and where the money came from. And I actually have to say that one of the things, I mean, I have an incredible board of trustees, very progressive and stuff like that. I have an incredible group of funders that are very progressive. But I also would like to say that I think we're over-taping stuff these days. And I can't talk frankly about stuff because we're on tape. I just wanted to say that not everything should be taped. Everything is taped. The other thing is that I know people have said, oh, I'm walking around here the last couple of days. People recognize me from YouTube videos of something I never signed a release for. And, it's like, what the fuck? But I think, and so anyway, so the other thing is that I always tell the same jokes. And so that's a problem if you've seen it on YouTube. So now I can't tell that joke next time, right? So this is my big complaint about the camera. But that having been said, and it's nothing against you as the cameraman. I mean, really, not at all. But if you just, so if you want to, no, but I mean, I just was beginning to talk a little bit about money. That's why I brought that up. But so $70 million. We got $70 million. We're doing this. We were talking earlier about, what does it mean to have an organization where people have benefits? Next year, we're going to be paying $800,000 in benefits to our staff, right? So this is part of being an institution. We had been on a panel together, Transformasium folks in Philadelphia, and we're talking about the difference. What if you don't become a nonprofit or this or that? If you become a nonprofit, there are rules about employment which were extremely hard for workers to get in America, completely over the dead bodies of management, right? And those things have to do with how many hours can you work before you become a permanent employee, paying unemployment insurance, Social Security, all that kind of stuff. Those are good things that were part of the progressive, labor movement that is now squashed. So we have a defined benefit pension plan. We have, dental, optical. And we pay very little money, but we have good benefits. So I just want to throw that in. It's okay. This is funny because this triggers in me all this thinking about money, because we're going to have to then run an institution that's much bigger. But that's not why I put the slide up. The reason I put the slide up is that we have now this idea of how do you build a building around social practice, right? So you got $70 million. What are you going to do? So one of the things we're doing is that the main aspect of our building is a central public space. The central public space is free. We're actually a free museum anyway. So you walk in, and you're going to be walking in from two different sides. There's a big skylight. You'll be able to see in from the park. And there'll be this big central meeting space. One of the things that we're going to try to do there, we're going to institute this in the fall, we have lots of things going on at the Queens Museum. So a couple of weeks ago, one of you was here. I can't remember who. We had a thing with Arte Util Lab with Tanya Bergera downstairs. We had some kids doing high school, art school preparation, and we had a program for parents of autistic kids in the autism spectrum as a photography class. All of them were happening separate places in the museum. So we went upstairs and got the sort of hipster artist to meet the families with the kids in autism spectrum. So actually, based on that particular moment, I said, now that we have this central meeting space as the essential aspect of our museum, let's have everything at the museum, begin or end at 4 o'clock, so that everybody comes together. We have one reception, right? And so the art therapists and the community organizers and the photographers and painters or whatever are just all standing together every week, every Saturday and Sunday. So that's the kind of mixing we're hoping to do. We're going to start a studio program in the museum. I mentioned before that the United Nations met in our building in 1946 to 50. If you look at this space over here, there's this hanging structure, and there's this space underneath it. By the way, this also doesn't look like a community center, right? And that's one of the things that even though we are a community center at some level, it's extremely exciting for a lot of people we're working with not to feel like they're in a community center. So we've spent millions and millions of dollars on the quality of the light in the building. I think it's important. And I think it's important for the art that we show as well as every other kind of art. So Pedro Reyes from Mexico City said, let's reconvene the United Nations. And we're going to have, this is a drone dove. If you see, it's a drone with a front of a dove, which he's going to hang in the middle of the space. And he said, we got the United Nations in Queens, right? So let's get together, Palestinians and Israelis. Let's get together, Kurds and whatever. But instead of a diplomat sitting in between them, let's have a marriage counselor or an art therapist or different kinds of mediators. So it's called the People's UN. So the idea is to use the history of the site to do these kind of interactive social projects, but in that kind of grand setting that we're going to have for the museum. All right. You know, I have one other piece of media I'd like to share, so maybe assessment. If anybody's interested in assessment, we can talk about this a little bit. Maybe I should go till 2:05. What do you think? What do you think, Jen?
We have till 2:30.
I know that, but we want questions, right? How important are the questions?
They're very important. Let's go to quarter after.
Oh, okay. Wow, thanks. You guys in the front row, I have to take you out for a drink later. It's been really great. The rest, no hope from back there. Well, I mean, I could come back. All right. Next question, I'll go to the back. All right. So listen, everybody's talking about assessment, right? So we came across a consultant who said, I'd like to try out something called collaborative action research. I mean, if people are involved in social science, you know what action research is. So how do you assess a group of multilingual, programs or, some community organizing activity? Collaborative action research mirrors social practice. The idea is to be self-critical. So let's say you're working on what are a series of classes. You set what are called research questions. You say, what are the questions I'm asking myself, and what do I want to get out of this for the community in this project? And collaborative means that you have a group of colleagues who are doing the same thing. You set out your questions at the beginning of the project. You meet periodically during the project. And you say, and the thing is that if you thought, for example, that your goal was language acquisition skills for kids in the autism spectrum, and it's not happening, but what's amazing is the socialization that's happening, that all of a sudden the Korean families over here and the Dominican families over there are meeting each other and they're going out together and they're feeling comfortable going to a museum. You just change your question. So the difference is this, what's called iterative and summative assessment. Iterative assessment is something that happens during the process and makes the process better. Summative means it's over. And most assessment is done in a way that's summative. So you do a project, you hire a consultant, they come in, they look at the project, they tell you if you did a good job or a bad job. You send it to the funder, and it doesn't affect anything. So this is our answer that we now give to everybody in terms of the funders, is collaborative action research. All right. There's another thing that we've used is called community network mapping. So if one of the things you're trying to do in your project is to create networks in communities, and by the way, that is a big goal of a lot of projects. You say, before this project, no one was talking to each other between these lines, social or racial or linguistic lines in our community. So this is a community network map that we had developed, which relates, so the way it works, this is again a longer discussion. So let's say you're a staff member. What organizations are you a part of?
I'm part of a social service organization.
Social service. You got any clubs you joined?
I'm in a piano club.
A piano club. Any tenants association?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So let's say you are in a social service organization. You're a member of a piano club, and what was the other one? Tenants association, right. So and those each have locations, right? So you put those locations, and that's a triangle. You just have these three. So there are some people that have like 5 or something. So you map all of your associations that you're part of. And communities, healthy communities have, so if you're, I don't know, where do you live? Where do you live?
Portland.
Portland, Oregon. Okay, all right. So whatever, I'll stop asking you. She's obviously not interested. Oh man, I did the front row again. I'm sorry. So the thing is that, so if you're in a community that has high social capital, what you're going to find is that you know somebody, you play the piano, right? When you sit down at the tenants association, or you go to work and there's somebody from your building, whatever. So one of the things that this is a sort of theory of social capital, is that you can have better social service outcomes in terms of things like school attendance, even health, if you have stronger communities without changing the economics. So, if people have these interchange, like, even Jane Jacobs talks about it in Death and Life of Great American Cities. You see the kid running down the street and you say, I'm telling your mother, right? because you know the mother, because you have this dense social network. So this is another way to assess what you're doing that's not economic. In other words, there are all these assessments that have to do with, oh, it was really good for the economy because we brought in all these tourists. Anyway, one of the things that I found to be appalling about our social networks is that Manhattan, even in Corona, is so dominant. This is something I learned from that. Okay, and I just quickly also, I'm going to get to one other more fun thing in a second. All right, so one of the things that we've been all talking about is this whole questions of aesthetics. This is not about the institution, but so why is this stuff called art? Does it matter if you call it art? Does it not matter if you call it art? And so I've been involved in this blog. Actually, John Muse has been a fantastic participant, and I'm, really, guys, really worth talking to. So anybody want to talk about aesthetics? See, he wasn't in the front row. I got back there. So I invite everybody here, if you haven't taken a look at it, just go to the Queens Museum website, its blog. And so there's this question of evaluation, which is us evaluating ourselves. This is not for grant. The first two were about how you get the grant, right? This is, so, what does good art look like? And if you go back, I talked to my sister who's a classicist. And back in the day, beauty, realism, and skill, right? These are the big three of aesthetics. You talk to somebody on the street and you say, oh, what's a beauty, what is it? What is great art? Oh, it's, the guy, painted a painting. It looked like a photograph. I couldn't believe the skill, right? So skill and realism, beauty. So then the question is, are there criteria that we use for ourselves to evaluate? And from the first couple of posts of the blog, these are some of the ideas that came forward, in terms of social complexity, relation to tradition, transformation, interesting terms of encounter, et cetera. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, which I am and John is, I don't know if anybody else in the room, go onto the blog and participate or read through it. And what is it that makes a good social project? It's not necessarily beauty, realism, and skill. Although I said this to Tanya Bruguera at Immigrant Movement, and she looked around and said, this is realism, right? So her vision of realism was exactly what was happening in that room at that moment. All right. So, and which I haven't gotten to this in the blog yet. So my question isn't whether this stuff is art or not, but what happens if you call it art? And I'm going to write something about this coming forward. Is Michael Kelly here? There he is, yeah. So this guy wrote me into writing something for an aesthetics encyclopedia, which I have to do. This is what I'm going to write about. All right. So by the way, if you want to talk about aesthetics, you can also talk to him. All right. We're reaching, all right. Hold on. Anybody ever heard of this song? Ugh. Jesus. That's embarrassing. Okay. All right, so again, to get back to the way I was talking about Bob Marley earlier. So I know that Grace knows what does anybody know what Gangnam Style is about? Yes, what's it about?
I had no idea, so I emailed my friend Aram in Seoul, and she explained to me that it's about a neighborhood in Seoul that's considered very materialistic. So it's actually a satirical, critical song.
Right. So, and then anybody know anything about K-pop? Yes, what can you say about K-pop?
Well, I have a 15-year-old. She knows everything. Would you like me to call her? I mean, I know because I hear it every day. But
So Korea is like the Ireland of Asia, right? It's always been under the umbrella of the powerful states next door, which is China and Japan. And to me, so this moment of, Gangnam Style has 500 million more hits than the next highest video on YouTube. 1.2 billion hits, right? This may be the most viewed work of art ever, in the history of our species, which is a little scary. But the thing is that what I liked about this particular video is that in Korea, so this is live. This is Psy performing live Gangnam Style. This only has, 95 million hits. So the thing is that everybody there knows this is this incredible sort of ecstatic, joyous moment for this crowd. And part of it is, there's just a fun, it's a concert. But part of it, I think, has to do with Korean identity, with this idea that we've come out of the shadow. And if you look at this, it's the whole crowd knows every word. So with that, I just, we need to learn the lessons from other kind of social practice artists, like Bob Marley and Psy. So that's it. Thanks.
We have time for questions. Are there any questions out there?
Hey Tom, thanks. Great talk. I'm interested in the millions of hits thing, right? Like the Bob Marley song, multiple millions of hits, and the grandness of the gesture of Nowhere Island kind of taps into this too, right? Like there's on one hand, there's a lot of talk about scale and amazing reach and reaching lots and lots and lots of people, and then I've also one of the things that I've been seeing a lot this weekend is work that has very, very small scale and very limited impact. What do you think about the relationship between those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are great projects in both. And yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So at the Queen's Museum also we have this idea. We have a school program that has tens of thousands of visitors where people come and they come for basically 2 hours and they do a little project about the panorama. And then we have another project where it's 4 years. And it's 13 to 25 kids. And some of them stay after the 4 years for 5 or 6 years. And it's, so the total number of alumni of that program, which is called Queen's Teens, and that's, by the way, a combination of education about art, and it's a job. So on the weekends, they're being paid. During the week, they have a free education program. So we have maybe, 100 alumni. And that's an incredibly important program that we do. It means a lot to us. Our Art Access has 5,000 visitors a year. And that's the special needs programming. But that's what you need to have is this intensive small scale. So, I just wish it's not even so much the reason that this has 95 million hits is that it's communicating, right? So that's it.
I really appreciate the foregrounding or the background that you gave with Saul Alinsky and the feminist precursors of this work. I think there needs to be a lot more of that at this conference so that people understand the radical place that a lot of this work is situated within. But I wanted to ask you a sticky question, which has to do with what does it mean to be an institution that's often supported by corporate grants and who maintains a progressive politics. How do we work within those institutional situations, especially if you want the work to create community, but you also want to create critical consciousness about the status quo and how it's affecting us, particularly in relation to environmental issues, issues about systems of oppression that might run really counter to your getting funding as an institution.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's why I have to turn off the camera. No. No, I mean, the thing is that the people in general who are supporting us are not necessarily supporting everything we do. So there are, corporations who just feel really comfortable just, whatever, supporting school programming. But they understand sort of the context within which it's happening. But this was a question. There was Creative Times Summit. There was a boycott because there had been some partnership with a group in Israel. And, actually no money had even been given to Creative Time from that. And so my feeling, or what I said at the Creative Time Summit was, if you can't come to this, what can you come to? So it's sort of different kinds of degrees of purity. And if you want to be completely pure, you really cannot have a cell phone. You probably can't wear any of the clothes you're wearing. You can't plug into an electrical light. You can't drive a car. So the question is where you draw the line. And is it a better, let's say, is there some good that transcends the participation co-optation, right? And I mean, you know what, I'm conscious of this all the time. I think a lot of us are. But so, I mean, we definitely have corporate sponsors. I mean, we do the Passport Fridays is Target Passport Fridays, right? Target is a store that whatever buys from all over the world, has its own. But Target's also incredibly progressive. Everything they do is free, right? So if you go to something, the brand of a Target sponsored event is it's going to be free and family oriented. So, these are the kinds of trade-off one makes. And if you don't, you definitely can't run a museum. There isn't a museum that will not take a corporate sponsorship that I know of. Is there? Anybody heard of one? So whatever. So that's, and then if you're too pure to go to the museum that takes money from Target or too pure to go on that night, that's your choice also.
Can I ask
Yes.
a follow-up question? Then what would happen if you had an artist who was deconstructing Target as a form of whatever it is within the museum?
Yeah. So I mean that has happened, and we've never stopped an artist from doing anything. We had a project. Kim Jones. You guys know Kim Jones, the Mudman. He had this is not about corporate, but just how far we're willing to go. So he had actually been not just indicted, but convicted of animal cruelty for a video that he made, and it was really terrible. I called up our lawyers hoping that they would say it was illegal to show it, but they said it's legal. As soon as it's legal, I'm a vegetarian, and we showed this video. So we'll show anything, and once the artist is in the door, we're not going to tell them they can't do something. We're working with Peter Schumann of Bread and Puppet Theater in the fall. We'll see how that works out. But he's a good old-fashioned radical who's likely to stick some needles into some stuff.
I wanted to ask just a question about museum practice and how you're really, as an institution, you're stretching the museum model, and you're being very thoughtful about both the way you're working with artists and the ways that you're working with the broad range of constituents that are there. And I don't know that I totally have a question, but I'm just interested in the impact of the kind of modeling that you're doing for the rest of the field, because it really stands out.
So yeah, I mean, I think there's progressive museums out there. There are beginning to be more. We tried to do an IMLS. We did an IMLS application to work with the Walker and the Hammer, which we felt were kind of sister institutions doing something. Some of them, I think, are here. But so I had this idea, and I don't know if I'm going to do it, probably, is that my next book would be about progressive practices at museums, and that, maybe that would be an interesting follow-up. So, I don't know. I mean, I do also want to say that I think that you can go look at a Mark Rothko, and it can be a liberating event in your life. And I really do believe that. That I've seen abstract paintings have been incredibly meaningful in galleries and museums where I paid money to get in. So I don't want to just, put aside. I think I'm a believer in art also. So whatever. I don't know if that answers your question, but I also think that one of the things we've been really careful not to do at the Queen's Museum is to overclaim. So we try to tell people what we're doing, but not to point fingers at anybody else in terms of their practices.
Hello. So I was just curious about this idea of a museum moving into social practice and outreach kind of transforming, and how your outreach has changed creatively over the years, as well as like maybe how word of mouth plays into the dynamic of integrating people into different projects.
Well, word of mouth within community. Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, we are in a community which has what is called, euphemistically non-traditional museum visitors. So we have to try non-traditional. Not to be critical of your vocabulary, but we try not to use the word outreach, because then it's out, and they're out there and we're in here. We're trying to, community engagement is, so, and we have people on our staff living in the community, and, so we try not to have an inside-outside mentality about it. And especially that, like the library partnership where we're meeting in people's communities, in native tongue, for programs that they have said that they wanted. It has to have something to do with art. We're not going to do, an accounting course. So it's a kind of in-depth, deep listening. By the way, one of the coolest things that's happened, I think, at the museum is that we have these big Asian, Mandarin-speaking population, big Spanish-speaking population. And at a certain point, a group of Mandarin-speaking people said, we're in Queens. We have to learn Spanish. So there's classes going on at Immigrant Movement where these mostly Ecuadorian and Mexican folks are teaching these Taiwanese and mainland Chinese people Spanish. And I thought, and that was done, that was completely done on their own steam. And they're there all the time. And it's, I think it has to do a lot with business. Like, they want to be able to talk to their customers when they're coming in the store and stuff like that. So.
Hi. What are some of the limitations that you've run into in these projects?
Limitations?
Yeah.
Money. Really, what we're saying is before about fundraising is that, so there are very progressive foundations. Right now, I have to say, we have funding problem, if there's any funders in the room, where our autism program is about to end because we can't find somebody and we'll still have our therapists on our staff. But that's a heartbreaking thing also. There's kind of commitment to these families. And I know these families, and these families count on it. And so it's more than just canceling whatever, some docent tour on the weekend. Not that that's not important also. So it is hard, but the main thing is money. And so look, if we're doing a Warhol show next year, because he did a project in Flushing Meadows, Corona Park, in 1964, and then that brings in more money, surprisingly easily. So, I don't know. That's it, yeah. If we had a lot more money, we could do a lot more cool stuff. But we do have this big building, and we have a bunch of money to spend in the next couple of years. And the question is, can we build the board? Then that's the other thing. We have to build our board. And it has to get richer, and when it gets richer, it gets more involved. And that's it. That's the way the game works, and that's America, right? So funding in America is not the NEA. Funding in America is tax structure. Tax structure leaves the decision-making process for what gets funded in the arts up to individuals, not to the group, right? So in Europe, you pay taxes, and then the state decides how to fund the arts. That's just not how we do it here. So we have to go find individuals. Yes, somebody out there, go. Some of you here, go make a lot of money. Yeah, yes, thank you. Good suggestion. Yes. Hold on, just a second. Here you go.
One of the most interesting parts for me, thank you for your talk, it was the community organizer hired as an art programmer, and I looked around the room and a few people cringed. Just this idea of overproduction of MFAs and MAs and curatorial programs, and just like this moment of recognition that we're not the best in what we're supposed to be trained at, and that there's a whole group, there's a whole history of grassroots organizing and community building that goes back 40, 60, like immigrants communities that have organized in order to survive, like this, the parenting, the child parent that you mentioned, like looking at those moments. And I'm wondering what are some of the fears of the institution, or what is like this overproduction of, like just the idea of someone else that is better at what I'm supposed to be doing. What is your experience working?
Well, I have two answers to that. One actually relates to the employment thing. I was talking to Harold last night. One of the things is, so you guys, you social practice people out here, us, we, I think you have a much wider range of opportunities. So we're just saying, what if you became a kindergarten teacher and you could integrate your social art aspect? You could have an incredibly satisfying life as an artist, as a kindergarten teacher, as a social practitioner, where you couldn't do that if you're my goal in life is to have, my paintings at the Guggenheim, right? So there is that. I don't know if that was part of your question, but we were talking about it. I thought I'd mention it. So all I'm saying, some of our, like Jose Serrano, you guys have met him. He's not a community organizer, he's an art guy. We sent him to community organizing school, and he, learned some techniques. You can learn it. It's not that hard. To be a really great organizer is a skill that might take many years, but it's not. The basic skills of organizing and techniques are something that everybody in this room could self-teach also. So I don't think it's, and then the thing is also, then it just depends on if you're good at it personally. Do you have the interactive skills? But that's part of being a social artist also, is to have those skills.
So there are a lot of questions. We're not going to get to all of them, but I'm going to remind you to please submit them online, and we'll take 3 more questions. We'll start right here, and I'm going to make my way over there because there are a lot of hands on that side of the room.
Thanks, Jen. There was something that you said when we were talking about the boat battle project that kind of bothered me, and I'm wondering if I just misunderstood, and so maybe you can help me clarify. You said that you had a lot of your maintenance staff come and be on the boat, and I'm wondering if, when I hear maintenance staff, I think like the people the other night that were China Light, like running around cleaning all the windows in the bathrooms while we were all there and joining China Light. Is that sort of what you meant by maintenance staff?
Yeah.
And they're wage workers?
These are salaried workers, and they were paid to do it.
Okay.
And these are, by the way, I will say, these are people who have insurance and dental, optical, defined benefit pension plans, who often work at the Queen's Museum for many, many years. But these people have also participated in art projects before and will in the future. And some of them are quite interested in doing that, and some are not. Mm-hmm. What I said was, it was during the summer, we had to call people back from vacation. They would have been on the team anyway, but they happen to be on vacation. But
yeah,
go ahead.
I
guess,
that part too, when you mentioned that you had to call them back from vacation.
Yeah,
it just
voluntarily.
It came across as like we called these wage workers back to come fight our battle for
interesting.
us
Yeah,
on the boat, and I was wondering if you could.
Well, I will say that. Thank you. This is always opportunity to learn, because the thing is that I'm thinking one particular guy and the thing is that this was, who was it? Deborah, you're here, right? We were there at this, Deborah Fisher. It was one of the most memorable nights for anybody who was there. It was just an absolutely legendary thing, and the folks who were on the boat are talking about it still. It was this incredibly energizing, fabulous, weird, scary thing. So, but the thing is that I felt relaxed enough with this particular person who did come back from vacation, who, by the way, was in the city. It wasn't like, this guy took a vacation we knew where he was. He wasn't like in, Florida or something. But no, but the thing that you're bringing up, well, I don't know if you're bringing up, but a thing that I'm thinking of, is in fact that when we called up Sean Leonardo, the performance artist, it was something that he had a much better chance of saying no to than Andre Baker, who said yes, but how could he say no, right? I think that might be part of your question.
The artists that you're naming are also the maintenance staff?
No, I'm sorry. Sean Leonardo is the guy who did the Lucha Libre performance. He is a muscle bodybuilder. He's a performance artist. We also called him up to be on our boat. We were looking for, muscular, and by the men and women, I will say. Anyway, maybe we could talk a little bit more afterwards, but I think that's a good question and worthy of consideration. Thank you. See, now the first row is not 100% with me, after all.
Are we ready? Tom, I have a question as an emerging artist, as we are often called. I'd like to know how emerging artists can best strategize to reject the limitations placed on them by art institutions, and when does it make sense to choose not to work with institutions that place too many restrictions on our work?
I think in a way the best people to ask that question to are not me, but senior artists, let's say, who have figured out how to. I will say that some artists I've talked to say, I'm teaching because then I get to make choices about where I'm going to. So if you figure out another way to make money that puts food on the table, then you don't have to say yes to everything. I mean, I've seen so many, especially critics, for example, who, let's say they were a curator and they lost their job, and all of a sudden they have to say yes to everything because they're putting food on the table by writing, for whatever, right? And that's hard. So that would, if I have any advice, but I think my main advice is don't talk to me because I'm an institution. And my second advice is figure out another way to make money.
All right, last question.
That's a bit of pressure. I wonder whether the social practice ethos is penetrated into the way that exhibitions at the Queen's Museum are in fact curated, whether there's a curatorial process that is, because you talked a lot about the exhibitions and opening the museum and the social practice artists that are making the museum what it is, and I would piggyback with what Gregory had to say about how inspiring that is, and I wonder whether, one thing you didn't talk about though, is the way in which these, whether it's Tanya's project or Sean's project, how those find their way into the museum, and whether there's an open process of some kind, some way that the community of museum goers, the audience of the museum is in fact engaged in some way in thinking about the exhibitions that would come to the museum, and the exhibitions that, and the artists that then find their way there.
Yeah, so in some ways the answer is very mixed, and some, we also do whatever photography show or this or that with a regular curatorial practice. So if you look at our website today, there is this, so we're doing a show. We do a show every 2 years of artists from Queens. It's called Queens International. It's very international because it's Queens. But the idea right now, and there's this proposal that that people come in with curatorial ideas, with design ideas, with interactive, with education programming and all that stuff, that there's a kind of a openness to structure the show from the artists who are going to be in the show. And the other thing is that we sort of, so we're, Los Angeles Poverty Department, LAPD, John Malpede's going to do a project with us. We're doing, Pedro Reyes. We're doing a bunch of shows, Bread and Puppet, which are, interactive, political, et cetera. And then the other thing is that, one of my great moments of my, I'd say professional career, I got to interview Paulo Freire. And he said, that there was a painting of a flower in the room where we were sitting in. And he said, look at this. This painting isn't a political painting, but you can talk about it, say, who has access to beauty? And so the artwork doesn't have to be political and doesn't have to be social in order to create a structure around it that's interactive and inclusive. We did a project which was a community-curated show from our collection, from photography, and the folks who chose the work wrote labels. And it was an ESOL class also, so writing the labels was this long process of editing and stuff. And the labels were incredible. The artworks that they picked were really surprising. The labels were amazing and much better than the curatorial labels, usually, that we write. So there are ways in which we're doing that, but I think it also, one of the things that we're trying to do is to say we're not a community center. We're trying to maintain this balance. And part of that is to have, fine arts curators who I disagree with about their practice at some level. But I intentionally, I hired fine arts curators. It's a complicated thing, because I want to have one foot in both worlds. And if you step too far into one world or the other, then you lose the dialogue. So I really thank you guys. This is incredible. So happy to be here.